The evidence for evolution made easy. The science of evolution is under attack by creationists. The majority of them do not even understand what evolution is, how it works, and what the evidence for it is. In this video, I hope to illustrate in simple terms how we know evolution is true. There are several lines of evidence that independently confirm evolution. That's what makes scientists so certain. Any one of these elements could have pointed to something else, but they all converge on the same conclusion, that all species emerged by common descent with modification through natural selection. Moreover, there are no credible, confirmed facts about nature that contradict evolution. Individually, each independent line of evidence I shall discuss very strongly supports evolution. But collectively, when you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, it becomes absurd to imagine that evolution did not happen. Evolution deniers have not provided any credible alternative theory that better explains all this evidence, or actually any of it. Before we get to the evidence, I need to be clear about what evolution is, define some terms, and dispel some misconceptions. I'm not going to be talking about Big Bang cosmology, the age of the Earth, or the beginning of life, called Abiogenesis. Those are separate matters with separate evidence. Evolution is the process by which all plants and animals have arisen from a single ancestor that existed in the past. Over the past 3.5 billion years or so, all existing and all extinct species on the Earth have emerged gradually in a nested hierarchy of groups and subgroups, sometimes called the tree of life. A species is best defined as a population of organisms with shared traits that can interbreed but cannot successfully breed with other populations. Throughout the biological history of the Earth, new species have emerged from existing species. The change from one species to another is very gradual. No animal ever gives birth to a different species. Genes are molecular units of DNA, by which organisms pass down their traits to their offspring. Changes in the genes of a species caused by mutation, sexual recombination, and genetic drift are passed down to their offspring. Over many generations, these small changes gradually add up to big enough changes that the descendant organism is different enough from its distant ancestor to be called a new species. Like a boy becoming a man, there is no single moment in time we can point to when the change occurred. It is very gradual. Evolution does not predict that a dog will give birth to a cat, or a half-dog, half-cat. It does not work like that. Natural selection is the key driving force of evolution. It is a natural process by which the beneficial changes tend to increase in a species and the detrimental changes tend to decrease. This occurs because those animals best suited to the environment tend to survive and procreate and thus pass down their genes a little bit more than those animals without the best traits. Each successive generation then tends to contain more of the beneficial genes and fewer of the less beneficial genes. Over many generations, this produces new versions of the ancestor animals that have changed features, new features, and even diminished or removed features. As groups of a species migrate to different environments, or the environment changes around them, their descendants tend to adapt differently, thus splitting a species into two or more subspecies. The ancestor species may later become extinct, or it may continue to exist, and may splinter off other new species. Often, one group will change faster than another group, because the selective pressure is greater. This is why we find creatures today that are more like their ancestors than their related species, such as humans and chimps. We share a common ancestor with chimps that was neither chimp nor human, but that ancestor looked more like a chimp than a human, as humans have changed more. All living species are related to each other, like distant cousins. The more recent the common ancestor, the closer they are related. This is exactly what the evidence shows, as I will explain. Fossils. The most tangible and obvious evidence for evolution is the fossil record. It is important to know that the process of fossilization is rare, and therefore the record is very incomplete, and it will always have gaps. Despite this fact, there are a great many species for which we have tremendous fossil evidence of their evolutionary change. The geologic column is what scientists call the layering of sedimentary rocks found all over the Earth. Although it does not exist in a single continuous column that we can see, we do find large segments of those layers exposed at the surface due to erosion and other geologic effects. Because these layer segments overlap each other, scientists have been able to match up the different segments to determine the overall sequence of layers. Multiple overlapping dating methods have been used to date these layers into geologic timescales. Even if you doubt the accuracy of these dating methods, as creationists who don't understand the science behind it do, it does not change the fact that fossils are always found in these layers in the order predicted by evolution. In fact, if we did find any fossils out of sequence, such as a rabbit in the Precambrian layers, which is long before the emergence of any mammal, that would falsify evolution, and we don't find that at all. Lenny Flank describes the fossil sequence like this, quote, "The fossil record grades clearly and unmistakably from simple early life forms, which appear early in the geological column, to larger and more anatomically complex forms, which appear later. The sequence of the appearance of various fossil groups, first invertebrates, then simple vertebrates, then jawed fishes, then amphibians, then reptiles, and finally birds and mammals, is exactly what we would expect from evolutionary descent with modification, with the organisms appearing higher in the geological column being the modified descendants of those organisms which appear lower in the column." Unquote. In these layers, we have found many fossils of extinct species that show the unmistakable signs of gradual changes from one form of animal to another. These are called transitional forms. One great example is the evolution of whales. Whales are mammals that live full-time in the ocean. We know from the fossil record that they evolved from four-legged land animals about 50 million years ago. Abiogenesis, which means walking whale, is one of several transitional species between land animals and whales. It had 4 legs, and it was clearly a water dweller, as its back legs were better adapted for swimming than for walking on land. And it probably swam by undulating its back vertically, as otters and whales do. Scientists consider Abiogenesis to be an early whale because it shares underwater adaptations with them. It had an adaptation in the nose that enabled it to swallow underwater, and its ear bones had a structure like those of whales, enabling it to hear well underwater, the same way that whales do, by picking up vibrations through its jaw. In addition, its teeth are similar to those of early whales. Its fossils have been found in the geologic column before modern whales and after more primitive tetrapod mammals, just as evolution predicts. What's more is we have discovered other transitional forms appearing after Abiogenesis that show the gradual migration of the nostrils from the front of the nose to the back of the head to become the blowhole, which made it possible for them to breathe without lifting their head out of the water. In some whales today, this blowhole is still split into 2 adjacent holes, and in others it is a single opening. Despite what creationists say, we have numerous other fossil transitional forms. Like Abiogenesis, these species share some traits with their ancestors and some with their descendants, and they are always found in the geologic column in the expected order. Here are just a few. showing a transition from fish to tetrapods, we have Tiktaalik, Ichthyostega, and Ventostega. From dinosaurs to birds, we have Archaeopteryx and Sonornis. From synapsids, which were large terrestrial vertebrates, to mammals, we have Dimetrodon and Diarthrognathes. And from primitive apes to humans, we have Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, and Homo erectus. Phylogenetics. As I already mentioned, the entire plant and animal kingdom is arranged in a complex hierarchical tree based on comparisons of physical traits. The study of this tree is called phylogenetics, and it is significant evidence for evolution because the similarities of animals in each group are a direct result of their common descent. For example, all mammals give birth to live young, produce milk to nurse their young, and have hair or fur covering their bodies, because those traits all came from their common ancestor that branched off from other tetrapods many millions of years ago and developed those traits. Once these types of major changes develop, they tend to remain unchanged in all the descendants for millions of years, even as they branch out into subgroups and species. And significantly, we don't see a mixing of these traits with animals outside the major group. There are no reptiles with fur, or birds that give birth to live young, because reptiles and birds are not mammals and did not descend from the early mammal species that was the ancestor of all mammals. It's not just the similarities within the groups that's important, but the arrangements of the differences. Creationists claim that these common traits are simply due to a common designer, but that does not explain why the common traits are only shared with members of the group, rather than all mixed in with other groups. There is no reason for an intelligent designer to create creatures in groups that only look like they inherited their traits from a common ancestor. A common designer would just add traits to any animal as it pleases, and there would be all manner of mixing of these traits. But we do not see this. In fact, a crocoduck, or anything like it, that shares traits from two diverged existing groups would actually be evidence against evolution, not for it. Interestingly, what appear to be exceptions to this rule also turn out to be evidence for evolution. Bats, for example, are mammals that fly. But they have no feathers, and their wings are very different from the wings of birds. Their wings are actually a webbing that extends from their elongated and articulated hand and finger bones down the side of their body, and it attaches to their back legs. They achieve lift by flapping this webbing with a hand-waving gesture. In contrast, birds get lift by flapping their rather stiff, feathered wings at the shoulder, and use their tail for stability and steering. These differences are due to the fact that bat wings evolved separately and independently from bird wings. This is called convergent evolution. Evolution found a different way to fly. If you are an intelligent designer who wanted to make a flying mammal, why not just give them bird wings? Or insect wings? Why reinvent the wing? Now that we've seen how phylogenetics reveals evolution, we can also see how it fits in with the other pieces of the puzzle. The phylogenetic tree and fossil evidence independently confirm each other, as we can trace the common traits of animal groups back to a common extinct ancestor in the fossil record. And the emergence of each of the new groups occur at different times in the geologic column. And also, the predictions we can make about common ancestry from the phylogenetic tree have now been spectacularly confirmed by DNA evidence, the mechanism for heredity, in ways even Darwin himself could not have imagined. as I shall show in the next segment. DNA. DNA is the complex molecule that passes down physical traits to offspring. Now that science has revealed the mysteries of this complex mechanism, and the complete genomes of humans and many plants and animals have been sequenced, many discoveries have been made that provide conclusive evidence for evolution. Those species that are closely related based on physical traits also prove to be closely related by matching up their DNA. Humans and chimps, for example, share over 98% identical DNA. The more closely related any two species are, the more common DNA we find, as we would expect. But moreover, there are several aspects of DNA that can only be explained by common descent. The first of these are called pseudogenes. These are sequences of DNA that are not used, but are left over from our ancestors that did use them. For example, most animal species can synthesize vitamin C, an essential nutrient. But humans and other higher primates cannot make vitamin C, so we must consume it in our diet. But our genes contain most of the genetic pathway to make it, the same sequence that is used by other animals. But a gene at the end of the sequence is turned off by a single mutation. There is no reason for that gene sequence to be present but not used unless it was inherited. Why would an intelligent designer add the whole sequence and deactivate it? And the same mutation that deactivates it is found in other primates, showing that we all inherited the mutation from a common ancestor. Humans share some pseudogenes with chimps, some with apes, more with primates, etc., which can only be explained by common inheritance. Another recent DNA discovery may be the closest thing to a smoking gun for evolution we will ever see. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. These are bundles of DNA genes. Our closest relatives, the other great apes, that is, chimps, bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas, all have 24 pairs. If we share a common ancestor, either the apes gained one or we lost one. Losing a whole chromosome would be fatal, but fusing two chromosomes into one would not be, as all of the genetic information can be preserved. The evidence clearly shows that this is exactly what happened. Human chromosome number 2 was fused from 2 ape chromosomes. How do we know this? Normally, chromosomes have markers in the middle called centromeres and markers on the ends called telomeres. A fused chromosome will have extra telomeres in the middle where they don't belong, and 2 centromeres. And this is exactly what we find in human chromosome number 2. And the specific genetic sequences of this chromosome match up almost exactly to 2 separate existing chromosomes in chimps, an unmistakable indication of our common descent. At some point after the human line split from the other ape lines, these 2 chromosomes were fused into one and passed down to the descendants ever since. See a great video with Ken Miller on this. Another discovery in DNA also clearly points to common descent. Endogenous retroviruses, ERVs for short, are virus DNA sequences inserted into an animal's DNA. When this happens in a germline cell, which is a sperm or egg cell, the retroviral DNA will be inherited by the descendants of the host animal, and always in the exact same location. Many different species have the same ERVs inserted in the exact same location in the genome, even though the location of the initial infection is random. Once again, proving common inheritance. The closer the relative, the more ERVs they share in common, and the nesting pattern of these matches the phylogenetic tree as predicted. There is no way for this to happen without common descent. And also, we have never found the same ERV insertion in species that split before the infection occurred. For example, all apes, including humans, share some ERVs in common that do not exist in any other mammals. So if you find a dog with an ape ERV, you could falsify evolution. ERVs act as phylogenetic markers and are clear indicators of common descent of different species. Because we now have very detailed data for many different species, you can look for non-coding DNA, including ERVs and pseudogenes, in different species and plot the similarities and differences. And we find that the similarities lie on a beautiful hierarchical tree, which can only be described as a family tree. Most significantly is that you can do that for any gene in the same animals, or even small mutations within the genes. And those similarities and differences always fall on the same family tree. That completely falsifies a single creation event. The only explanation is common inheritance. Richard Dawkins calls this the single most conclusive proof of evolution. In fact, he says that even if we had no fossils, this fact alone would prove evolution is true. Geographic distribution. The geographic distribution of animal species across our planet matches what evolution predicts. As animal populations spread out into new environments, and particularly when some of them become isolated by geographic formations, such as mountains, rivers, or oceans, those isolated populations tend to adapt differently than their ancestors, and new species emerge. Charles Darwin famously studied the finches and other animals that populate the Galapagos Islands, and noticed that they bear many similarities to those found on the nearest mainland in South America, hundreds of miles away, but also had significant differences, and also varied from island to island. This indicated to him that the finches on the islands were the descendants of birds that had long ago migrated from the mainland, and there they diversified into new species. This is one of the key discoveries that led to his theory of natural selection. It shows how the isolation of the islands and the differences of the environments allows natural selection to create new species. And we see evidence of this all over the globe, where animal species separated by geography are related but different from other species in neighboring areas. If you believe in Noah's flood, or even if you don't, but believe in a one-time creation within the last, say, 10,000 years, either way, you have to explain how all the animals spread out from a central point, but somehow knew to migrate in groups by phyla, family, and species. For example, Australia and New Zealand are populated with many species of marsupial mammals, which are those that have pouches, such as kangaroos, wallabies, and koalas. And there are very few endemic non-marsupial mammals, called placental mammals, found there, and few marsupials found anywhere else. The logical explanation is that they evolved in that region separately, after branching off from their common ancestor with other mammals. Or perhaps the marsupials just knew to march off Noah's Ark right down to Australia, leaving the placental mammals behind. Another type of evolutionary geographic distribution that clearly shows how evolution works is a phenomenon called ring species. There are many of these found throughout the world, and one great example is the Ensatina salamander of California. Ring species occur when a species becomes geographically distributed in a circular pattern over a large area, often around a physical barrier, in this case, the large Central California basin. Immediately adjacent or neighboring populations of the species living around this ring vary slightly but can interbreed. But at the extremes of the distribution, the opposite ends of the pattern that link to form a circle, natural variation has produced so much difference between the populations that they function as though they were two separate, non-interbreeding species. While this is on a small scale compared to the grand scale of all of evolution, ring species demonstrate in the spatial dimension something that always happens in the time dimension: gradual change from a common ancestor. Evolutionary baggage. Man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. Charles Darwin. When looking at all life that exists today, we can see many features that are clearly the result of our evolutionary past. One type of this evolutionary baggage is called vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are parts of animals, including humans, that have been inherited from their ancestors, but no longer serve the purpose for which they first developed. Examples include pelvic bones in whales, wings on ostriches, dew claws on dogs, and the human appendix. Notice that some of these structures do serve a purpose, and creationists like to say that if they serve a purpose, they must not be vestigial, but that is not the case. Evolution often works by repurposing structures that are no longer needed for their primary purpose. The important thing to notice is whether they are necessary, not whether they are useful. The wings on an ostrich, for example, are used for balance, display, and cooling, but they are anatomically equivalent to wings used for flying in other birds, and not used for flight. They are clearly not necessary for their survival. There would be no reason for a designer to give them wings that they don't use for flight. Other animals in the same environment get along fine without wing-like cooling structures. The evolutionary explanation is that they are left over from ancestors who did fly. Gradually, the ancestors of today's ostriches adapted to living full-time on the ground, and at some point lost the ability to fly, but retained their wings, and co-opted them for other purposes. Similarly, the human appendix may be used to some extent by our digestive and immune systems, and likely was required by our ancestors who relied heavily on a diet of leaves, but we certainly can live perfectly fine without it today. In fact, about 250,000 people per year must have their appendix removed surgically when it becomes inflamed. Without surgery, many of them would die. This shows that not only is the appendix not necessary, but we would be better off without it. Vestigial structures always prove to be left over from an ancestor that did use them for the primary purpose for which they evolved. Creationism provides no valid reason for these structures to exist. We also find many vestigial structures that start to develop in embryos, but disappear or change to a different structure later in development. For example, human embryos start to develop tails, and dolphin embryos start to develop legs. We know these are remnants of their evolutionary ancestry because they match up to the early development of these same features in related species that still develop and use them. In very rare cases, we find animals that are born with ancestral features not normally present in the species. These are called atavisms. They occur when an existing gene that is normally deactivated in a species gets reactivated by a mutation, allowing the ancestral feature to partially or even fully develop. Observed examples include dolphins born with legs, and even some humans born with tails, some of which even have articulated vertebrae and the muscles to move them. Only evolution can explain this. Also, there are no atavisms observed that evolution would not predict. We find no nipples on birds, or horns on apes, or anything of the kind that does not fit the evolutionary model. Another type of evolutionary baggage is what I would call bad design. Evolution works mostly by building on and modifying the structures it already has available, without the benefit of foresight or the ability to go back to the drawing board and start from scratch. And we see signs of this all through nature. A great example is the recurrent laryngeal nerve. This is a nerve in all mammals that connects the brain to the larynx, or voice box. Because of the way it evolved, it exits the brain, passes by the larynx, and loops around a major artery near the heart, and then back to the larynx. There is no functional reason that it loops around the artery, only an evolutionary one. It evolved in the fish-like ancestors of modern tetrapods, traveling from the brain past the heart to the gills as it does in modern fish. Over the course of evolution, as the neck extended and the heart became lower in the body, the laryngeal nerve was caught on the wrong side of the heart, creating an unnecessary detour. In humans, this is a small detour of just a few inches. In giraffes, the round trip down the long neck and back up measures about 15 feet. No intelligent designer would do that. If you are a male over the age of 50, you may have already experienced discomfort or pain caused by another example of bad design. The prostate gland is a reproductive gland in male mammals that surrounds the urethra. There is no functional reason for it to be wrapped around the urethra, but it is there because it evolved from tissues inside the urethra. Unfortunately, this gland is prone to infection and swelling later in life, causing difficult and painful urination, and in some cases, requiring surgery. No intelligent designer would wrap a gland that swells around a collapsible tube. If any of this evolutionary baggage really was the work of a designer, many of his designs are illogical, inefficient, useless, redundant, and even harmful. In other words, not very intelligent. But they make perfect sense in light of the way evolution works. Evolution actually does perform design, in a sense, but it is a bottom-up, stepwise improvement type of design, rather than a top-down, purposeful, and pre-planned design. And when you look closely at the natural world, this is very obvious. Direct observation. Creationists sometimes say that evolution cannot be proven because it has never been seen to occur. This is not a very reasonable requirement when you consider that evolution almost always takes hundreds or thousands of generations to produce significantly different new species. When shown examples of speciation that we can observe within our lifetimes, creationists claim that that's just adaptation, not speciation, and that adaptation has limits. However, none of them have ever been able to demonstrate, or even propose, a biological mechanism which stops small changes from accumulating into big changes. A journey of 1,000 miles always begins with a single step. The same is true for evolution. Mutation and natural selection modifies the descendants of animals very gradually, generation after generation, into new animals, accumulating small beneficial changes into big changes. Despite the long time scales ordinarily involved, there are many cases of evolutionary change we can directly observe within a reasonable time frame. One great example of this is the lizards of Podmurcaru Island. In the 1970s, 5 pairs of a species of lizard called the Italian wall lizard were introduced to the Croatian island Podmurcaru from a neighboring island named Podkopisti. About 37 years later, scientists returned and discovered that the descendants of those lizards had developed remarkable physical changes from their ancestral species. They had a larger average size, and in particular a larger head, which gave them increased bite strength. This was an adaptation to a different food source, as the new island had much more vegetation.
On the relatively barren island Podcapisti, they had subsisted mostly on insects. Because plants are tough and fibrous, high bite forces allow the lizards to chomp off smaller pieces from the plants, which makes digestion easier. Examination of the lizard's digestive tracts revealed something even more surprising. Eating more plants caused the development of new structures called cecal valves, a relatively rare adaptation, which slows the passage of food by creating fermentation chambers in the gut, where microbes can break down the difficult to digest portions of plants. By isolating a tiny population of lizards in a new environment, researchers were able to demonstrate evolution in action in just a few decades, with dramatic results, including the emergence of a whole new anatomical structure. Another well-known study is the long-term evolution experiment led by Dr. Richard Lenski using E. coli bacteria. Since bacteria reproduce very quickly, they provide an accelerated way to observe evolution. Since 1988 and continuing to this day, Lenski has been tracking genetic changes in 12 initially identical populations of E. coli. As of 2014, each of the 12 isolated populations have reproduced for 58,000 generations. The researchers have observed a wide array of genetic changes. Some evolutionary adaptations have occurred in all 12 populations, while others have only appeared in one or a few populations. One particularly striking adaptation was the evolution of a strain of E. coli that was able to use citric acid as a carbon source in an oxygen-rich environment, a completely new trait. This clearly demonstrates how evolution produces new species. Of course, the descendants of the bacteria are still bacteria, as creationists like to point out, but they're a new kind of bacteria, and that is how evolution always works. Mammals are a special kind of tetrapod. Primates are a special kind of mammal. Apes are a special kind of primate. And humans are a special kind of ape. Animals never entirely stop being what their ancestors were. They just change into new versions of that animal. It generally takes large spans of time before the differences outnumber the similarities, and the new animals are considered a new species. Another way we can directly observe evolution is that we can sometimes see the different stages of development of structures within existing creatures. The eye is a great example of this. Even complex structures like the eye have evolutionary pathways that we now understand and involve many gradual steps. Since eyes are so useful, they have actually evolved many times in separate ancestral lines of animals. Another great example of convergent evolution. And we can actually see the different stages of this evolution in living animals today. In its most basic form, an eye can be just a few light-sensitive cells that can detect light or dark, such as the two-cell eye of the marine ragworm embryo. The next step would be developing a cup-shaped area of light-sensitive cells, which would add the useful ability to determine the direction light was coming from. And we find these in some flatworms today. The pinhole camera eye developed as the cup-shaped pit deepened into a chamber. By the reduction of the size of the opening, the organism acquired true imaging, allowing for fine directional sensing and even some shape sensing. Eyes of this nature are currently found in the nautilus. The next step came about as a clear membrane grew to close over the eye opening, which served to keep sand and water out of the eye interior and also acted as a lens that focused the light and provided a clearer image. Today, we see these rudimentary lenses in the stem-shaped eyes of the conch. From there, it only takes some small refinements, such as lens shaping, and muscles to better control focus, to get to the highly capable eyes we humans have and share with most other vertebrates. Not only does this dramatically demonstrate that complex structures can evolve through gradual steps, it is important to notice that there is no logical reason for an intelligent designer to give different animals varying sight capability, when he certainly could have given them all the eyes of a hawk. Only evolution explains the large variety of eye types that we find in nature. And these eye types clearly demonstrate the gradual steps involved in the evolution of the eye. In conclusion, as you can see by now, to disprove evolution, you would have to explain away tons of evidence. Many creationists simply deny that this evidence exists, and they imply that all scientists are involved in a conspiracy. That, of course, is absurd. It's been over 150 years since Darwin published his groundbreaking work, and hundreds of thousands of scientists have been busy studying the evidence ever since. Yes, creationists have made some counter-arguments to these lines of evidence that I have presented, but the scientific community that studies the evidence and understands it best has repeatedly found those counter-arguments to be without merit. Some creationists even go so far as to say that evolution is not true science because it is not directly observable or testable, and they falsely distinguish it as a historical science and say it requires faith because, well, you weren't there to see it. But nothing could be further from the truth. I have already shown how evolution is observed directly, but moreover, the evidence left behind by evolution in living creatures, in fossils, and in DNA provide direct and conclusive evidence of the evolution that occurred in the past. And also, evolution is testable. But since evolution occurs very slowly, and did occur mostly in the past, the tests we can perform are different than those kinds of tests that we would perform on an immediate phenomenon such as gravity or a chemical reaction. Evolution is tested simply by looking for more evidence. DNA is still being sequenced and analyzed. Fossils are still being found, and new living species are still being discovered. Time and time again, these new discoveries fit the evolutionary model, and none contradict it. Moreover, there have been many cases in which pieces of evidence that had not yet been found were predicted to exist. A great example is the transitional form from fish to land animals. Based on the evidence already gathered and an understanding of evolution, scientists predicted in which geographic location and in which layers of strata such a transitional fossil might be found. And after looking in those places, the discovery of Tiktaalik fulfilled that prediction. Also, all scientific claims are always open to falsification, and scientists actually work hard at proving each other wrong, and often do. But while some of the details of how evolution works are still being discovered and debated, no one has ever come close to falsifying the fact of evolution, or discovered any evidence that calls it into question, or provided a better explanation for the evidence we have. With all these confirmed lines of evidence, and direct observation, and testability, and predictive ability, and falsifiability, evolution meets all the criteria of a real science. And creationism, by the way, meets none of them. In fact, evolution is one of the most well-evidenced conclusions in all of science. There is so much evidence that paring it down to this brief summation was a challenge. For every example given, there are many more. Research it more yourself and you will see. But be sure to choose good scientific sources or articles that reference them. There is a lot of misinformation out there. Beware of any site or publication whose primary agenda is anything other than promotion and education of good science. I encourage you to continue to research and learn about evolution on your own, and hope that you find it as fascinating and enlightening as I do.